In this week's episode of Bleach the Thousand Year Blood War, we finally get to meet several of the dreaded Sternritter. The captains have their Bankai stolen from them, and Ichigo himself is locked within a Garganta, unable to rescue his friends. Episode 4, Kill the Shadow, was my favourite episode of the series so far, which honestly I am overjoyed to be able to say, as this was a part of the story I have been both looking forward to with anticipation and apprehension. But I'm happy to say that despite it still suffering from a few of those persistent issues, I think overall they absolutely got this right and totally nailed that chaotic feeling of the first Quincy invasion. And as you will see as we move through our in-depth spoiler review and discussion, this was actually one of the more faithful episodes so far as well, while having a healthy amount of new extended content. Yes, there is still cut content as well, but in my opinion, none of it was too egregious, and for the most part, the core of the episode was conveyed nearly perfectly. And honestly, I think that is what is most crucial as we move into the first Quincy invasion itself. They have to really capture that sense of danger, that sense of despair, particularly in the upcoming episodes when everything gets really ramped up, but of course we'll talk about that in our prediction section. But for now, as the invasion gets underway, I'm very happy with how it's looking. And of course, now that we're actually introduced to the Sternritter properly, getting to see them brought to life on the screen after so many years of waiting for someone who's actually a genuine fan of the Sternritter like I am, something of a dream come true. And as always with our in-depth spoiler review and discussion series, we'll be taking a look at the episode through the lens from the perspective of someone who is very familiar with the Thousand Year Blood War arc of the source material. We'll be taking a look at what is added in the episode, what they've changed as part of their adaptation, and of course even what they've taken away. And so naturally there will be spoilers, full spoilers, for the Thousand Year Blood War arc ahead. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support for me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well. And to everybody supporting me over there, as always, I want to say a massive thank you to each and every one of you. I really do appreciate it, and honestly couldn't do this week in, week out without you. So I thought this was a really interesting episode from a pacing perspective. Yes, it was still lightning fast, as they have been so far, but I really didn't feel the effects of that quite so much this week, and I don't really know why. Maybe it's because the scenes as they were presented felt a whole lot more faithful to the source material, as we'll see later on in this video, but perhaps as well it was the fact that they didn't really cut too much. But as we always begin these spoiler review videos, let's take a look at what was actually covered in this week's episode, Kill the Shadow. And guess what? If you go back to my predictions at the end of last week's spoiler review, you'll see that I was actually right on the money this time, which feels really good to be able to say for once. Yes, this episode covered chapters 495 right the way through 499. So that's 495, Bleeding Guitar Blues, one of my absolute favourite chapter titles in the series. 496, Kill the Shadow, the title of the episode, and a fun fact, the chapter I first ever reviewed on YouTube. My first ever video on this channel was reviewing chapter 496. 497, Kill the Shadow 2, 498, The Dark Rescuer, and 499, Rescuer in the Dark. And this selection of chapters makes total sense to me. As I said last week, ending the episode with Quilge trapping Ichigo within the Garganta, with the Garganta sealing shut around Ichigo and preventing him from going to the Soul Society, is a great cliffhanger. It was really effective in the manga, and it's really effective here as well. Plus, it means we get another episode with Quilge OP rather than killing him off at the end of this one. But firstly, before we kind of dive into the spoiler analysis of this episode, there's a recap. Yes, the extremely long recaps of old for Bleach have seemingly returned, and I'm really not sure how I feel about this. On the one hand, I thought it was well put together. It was kind of neat seeing the first 3 episodes of the Thousand Year Blood War condensed like that, and the soundtrack I thought was absolutely phenomenal. And it did make me wonder if maybe we'll be getting a recap every 3 episodes or so, if they decide to kind of condense each set of 3 into their own mini storyline, perhaps. Which maybe explains why they were so desperate to cram 494 into the end of episode 3. At the same time, a recap is so not necessary, and we're already running on very limited time as it is, so to have an entire 3 minutes or so taken up by a recap of stuff that we could literally just go back and watch. I've seen some people saying that a recap is indicative of production issues, and I hope that's not the case. In general, I still think everything looks amazing, I still think the art looks incredible, but I will say I do think, from having stopped the episode an awful lot to get screenshots of it, that there are becoming more and more frames that look a little bit rough around the edges. But on the whole, I still think the character close-ups look great, and I still think the action is smooth and fluid, and overall it's still a really nice looking show. Apparently I was on a bit of a roll last week, as I was mostly correct with my predictions regarding how the episode would actually begin as well. I thought they would take the final page from 494, which wasn't adapted into last week's episode, and put it at the start of this one, and that is essentially what they've done. We get this really amazing look at the Sternritter from afar, with the pillars of blue flame erupting from the ground. In my opinion, this is a much better way of showcasing the scope and the scale of this invasion than having the pillars just bursting up from the ground like they did last week. Last week they looked really kind of close together. Here you can see that the entirety of Sternritter is ensnared in this attack. But the episode kind of begins with a cut down version of that final page from 494, featuring Akon, featuring the other Shinigami of the Research and Development Division, talking about the casualties, the losses, who's dead, who's defeated, whose Reiatsu has vanished, including Kira's, and of course the seated officers of the 3rd Division as well. All of this takes place at the end of chapter 494, with Akon basically thinking, how can we ever possibly defeat these people? The Shinigami are also talking about how the enemy has captain-level Reiatsu in 16 different locations across the Soul Society, which I always thought was a really important line, as it immediately establishes that there are more captain-level opponents than there are actual captains of the Gotei 13. The actual dialogue on show here is kind of a combination, though, of the end of 494 and the very first page of 495, but considering they both effectively achieve the same thing, I think it makes sense that only one of this set of dialogue was actually used. However, we get our first big structural change of the episode, as rather than go straight into chapter 495, we instead skip an entire chapter and go straight to the start of 496, where we get to see Sternritter B, Ugram Hashwolf, emerging from one of the pillars of flame as he faces down Squad 13. Of course, Kajamaru tries to stop him, but Hashwolf kills him with a single slash, cutting him in half. This scene is basically shot for shot identical to how it appears in the manga. They pretty much have the exact same dialogue as well. And I'm really happy about that, because I always thought this was a really awesome scene. I love the way Hashwolf comes across here. It's so cool that Kajamaru is trying to exert the authority of the Soul Society, of the Gotei 13. He says to him, don't mock the Gotei 13, I'm asking you to stop. And Hashwolf says, you're so overcome by fear that you're trying to make this life or death situation into just about stopping me from progressing, but we did say the war has already begun. And I love that. I think that is such an awesome scene. Rest in peace, Kajamaru. We didn't know you for very long. But it's still a really well done scene. I think it really gets across how kind of, sinister and how much business Hashwolf actually means. Again, as I correctly predicted last week, they do cut the entirety of that scene where Squad 13 loses the will to fight after seeing Kajamaru killed. This occurs later, but regardless, it's not in the episode at all, and Hashwolf kind of asks Yhwach what he should do about these Shinigami. I'm not surprised that scene is gone. Like I said last week, it felt a little bit superfluous, and again, I'm just not surprised it's not here. It is the kind of, I think it's the last appearance of the character Shino. We do see Yuki a couple more times later on, but I think this is her final appearance, so maybe this is the last time we would have ever seen her in the anime, although interestingly, both Yuki and Shino are not present in this scene in the anime anyway. But I mean, it's pretty obvious why this scene was shifted up. It's literally just to have the title card, and it's again exactly the same as it appears in the original chapter, with Kill the Shadow being written in the blood splatter left behind by Kajamaru. And again, they go kind of like really gory with it. They show Kajamaru's shadow cracking and splitting in half. Like, it's pretty messed up, but pretty effective. And now we return to the start of chapter 495, where we get my boy Rose with his scene against Sternritter Yu, Nanana, Najakoop. And again, this scene is very faithful. I said last week I expected them to keep this scene in, of course, because we've seen it in trailers, but to cut it down a bit. But actually, it is here word for word, which I'm pretty happy about. It starts off by showing us a hell butterfly approaching Rose to inform him of the news that's being passed around about all the dead Shinigami, including Kira. This does happen in the source material, but the hell butterfly is considerably less visible there than it is here, to the point where you could quite easily miss it. We get Nanana Najakoop's title card here as well. In the manga, this was the first Sternritter name title card we ever got. We technically did get Quilge OPs before this, but he wasn't referred to as a Sternritter. Here in the anime, Quilge was referred to as a Sternritter in his title card, which honestly makes a lot more sense. But I'm really glad to see this scene is here in its entirety, because Rose is a really cool character. I think he looks really nice with the new kind of colouring and drawing and art style they've got going on. He's got some great shots here. And again, it's just so surreal to see characters like Nanana finally being presented on screen. Nanana's not a particularly great character. He's not a character I care about, but it's still cool seeing him here. I definitely do prefer him with the yellow visor that he has in the digitally coloured version of the manga that you'll see on screen. I definitely think he looks a little better like that. But regardless, this is still cool to see nonetheless. I've got to be honest, while this scene was included here in its entirety, I don't think we'll be getting any extensions to this fight at all, as next week, Nanana will probably meet a crispy fate at the hands of Yamamoto. But we're already getting ahead of ourselves, let's carry on with the episode. Up next is another extremely faithful scene. This is what I mean about this episode feeling a lot more faithful, like it follows the manga a lot closer than some of the previous episodes have. Here we see Sternritter F, again given his title card as not, and a character that I think people have been dying to see, myself included, easily one of the standout Quincy's, and possibly the major standout Sternritter of this entire first Quincy invasion, although I do have to give major props to Quilge OP as well. But this scene plays out again basically exactly the same way as it does in the original chapter. Az is attacking the 6th Division, he's walking towards them in this really ominous manner, his thorn arrows are blasting and striking Shinigami, and it's really well done in the anime. There's this really truly unsettling and creepy feeling to Az's power. Of course, the soundtrack over the top is again like chilling and spooky, but it's really cool seeing these like deceased Shinigami suddenly opening their blank eyes and shrieking at the top of their voices as the fear begins to truly affect them, although presumably they're dead at this point anyway, so I don't quite know how that's working. But regardless, it still sets the tone fantastically for this character. I love that the music in the background is like this kind of really eerie lullaby almost. I think I said in my live reaction that I'm pretty sure this soundtrack has been used in the past, but if it is an as not specific one, I think it works perfectly. As the Shinigami retreat, one of the soldiers tries to keep them all facing as not, but eventually Renji comes in and saves his life. Again, this is basically panel for panel exactly the same as the source chapter. Renji sending Zabimaru crashing down between Az and this Shinigami, and then Az creepily looking up at him from behind his hair, which again looks absolutely fantastic, and I love how faithful they've been with Az, because he's a character who just looked amazing in the original chapter. A fun fact for you, this particular Shinigami, whether he is the same in the anime or not, I'm not sure, but in the source material, this Shinigami here, who Renji commends for standing his ground, for keeping to his post, is the same officer that tries to stand up to Renji when he is rushing to save Rukia right the way back in the Soul Society arc. And Kubo did a decent amount of that in the first invasion, bringing back old Shinigami faces, which I thought was a really cool little touch. And again, we get another scene that is basically a replication of the manga itself. When Bambietta Bastabine attacks the 7th Division, we get her title card as well. When she slices through through the Shinigami. There's a blink and you'll miss it shot of her behind them, which wasn't actually in the manga itself, but it's really cool, like, imagining her being so quick they can't see her as she moves right through them. Komamura then, of course, arrives, grabbing Bambietta's arm and stopping her rampage. It is funny, Komamura's line about how the enemy army is even using a little girl like you doesn't really fit when you know what Bambietta is like later on, but the same is true, of course, for the source material as well. And then we get the matchups from chapter 495, Hisagi versus Driscoll, Kyoraku versus Robert, Soifon versus BG9, Hitsugaya versus Kangdu, and of course, Ukitake versus his mystery opponent. Now, in my opinion, it's still unclear who this actually is. Personally, that hair doesn't really look like Askin Naklavar to me. It could be Nyanzol Weisel, but I'm not even sure it looks like him either, although presumably it has to be one of them. But Nyanzol has extremely long hair for starters, and we've also never seen him wearing the Sternritter cloak. But I mean, it's possible it is him, and I kind of hope we get some confirmation on that in a future episode. We get a nice little showcase of Renji battling Az as he sends Zabimaru flying towards him. Az bats it away with his hand as blue vein appears on his skin. But of course, Renji is in real trouble as suddenly he's attacked from above by Sternritter S Mask to Masculine. There's a nice moment where Mask crashes into the floor. Renji sort of dives out of the way. In the original chapter, Mask just kind of reaches for Renji out of the rubble. But here, there's a nice moment where he turns, looks up at Renji and actually leaps towards him, which I think is probably a little more fitting, but for the most part this scene plays out exactly the way it does in the original chapter, with Senbon Sakura rushing in to block Mask's hand to protect Renji, and Byakuya arriving on the battlefield telling Renji, don't show these people mercy, they have arrived to destroy Soul Society without question, they are absolutely enemies. And that's really cool, and that is the end of chapter 495, signalling Byakuya's arrival as Asnod kind of looks on in a ominous fashion. Next up is a brand new scene, the first of many in this episode, as we actually get to see Mayuri working away in his secret lab as he is studying Gonryu Maru itself. The actual Zanpakuto is within a tank in front of him and he is working on a computer. Something pops up saying negative, to which Mayuri says, interesting, they're not actually putting a seal on our Bankai at all. And of course, this is all designed to kind of reinforce the notion that the captains think that the Quincy can seal Bankai rather than steal it. Like I said in my live reaction, the captains were mocked by readers back in the day for being so gung-ho, without really expressing any notion of a plan, without really having any idea about what the Quincy were doing. But with Byakuya arriving on the scene, the anime cuts out Renji's line where he tells Byakuya that he wasn't showing them mercy at all. At which point Az proceeds to try and advance on them, but Byakuya attempts to attack him with Senbon Sakura. The petals encroach Az's hand, to which point Renji says, our blades, they can't penetrate them at all, to which point Byakuya says that's not possible, and Az's hand explodes with blood as he looks on in kind of, it's not really horror, I think it's more a morbid fascination with Senbon Sakura. That's again basically exactly the same as it is in the source material. Man, I mean, so far this episode's making my life pretty easy by not really having that many changes at all, but that will differ later on in the episode. Mask to Masculine kind of rushes over to Az, not asking him what he's doing. There is a line in the manga here that's cut out where he asks Az, explicitly calling him by his name, why he allowed his blute to be shattered so easily. When Byakuya sends Mask falling through the ground, in the anime we actually get to see Senbon Sakura kind of rain down upon him, destroying the floor beneath his feet. But in the original chapter, Mask just sort of falls through the floor, to which Byakuya says, I destroyed the footholds beneath you on my way here. This is where we start to get those long-awaited extensions to the battles of the first invasion. While this is really cool, I'm definitely hoping we get a little bit more next week as well. But yeah, we get some really great back and forths here. Asnot generates one of his thorn arrows, slings it at Byakuya, who deflects it with his Zanpakuto, and then rushes at Asnot. Az prepares to attack him again, but Renji wraps Zabimaru around him, giving Byakuya an opening to slam Senbon Sakura right into Az's head. As we saw in one of the trailers, however, Asnot reveals that he is completely unharmed as he rears his head once once again, one of Senbon Zakura's petals sticking out of his eyeball, having been protected by Blute itself, which is a great moment, a really kind of hardcore moment that shows you just how powerful, how durable these Sternritter might actually be. And it's really cool to see that. It really gives you the impression that these guys aren't messing around at all. I'm not sure how believable it is that Az would be able to withstand a direct attack from all of the Shikai's petals at once, that Blute can just cover his entire face apparently, but for a cinematic moment, I do really like it. As the Sternritter just sort of throws off Zabimaru and then summons more thorns to continue the fight, this is all great stuff, and it's really cool seeing Byakuya and Renji actually working together. I think I mentioned in a video a while back that I would have loved to have seen more actual teamwork from these two, and so getting to see Renji incapacitating Az, allowing Byakuya to go in for this devastating hit, was really cool. But that's not the only fight to get an extension, as all of the Bankai Stealing battles get extended in some way. Komamura's fight against Bambietta gets a nice extension as well. He swings his blade at her, smashing it into the ground, but Bambietta leaps into the air, avoiding it. Now this next bit is really intriguing to me in that I'm not entirely sure it's 100% accurate, but Bambietta summons one of her reishi balls, a really nice piece of animation here as well, and then sort of kicks it towards Komamura. Again, just a lovely action. Komamura slices this ball of reishi in half, to which Bambietta smirks, and suddenly those two halves detonate, exploding in Komamura's face. That's all well and good, and of course it's a hint towards her shrift, the Explode, which we wouldn't properly find out about until the second invasion, but I'm not entirely sure this is exactly how that shrift works. That should literally just be a ball of reishi, and if Komamura cuts it in half, nothing should explode until maybe those two halves land in the ground, at which point Bambietta can turn the floor into a bomb. But she pretty explicitly says that she doesn't throw bombs, she throws reishi that can turn anything into a bomb. So it shouldn't just be blowing up in Komamura's face like that, but at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal because this is an awesome little extender to this fight, and it's really cool seeing Bambi using her weapons in such a creative way. The two of them then clash, Bambietta goes flying towards Komamura and they lock blades, and all of that is just so cool. This, however, may actually be my favourite extended fight moment of them all, as we arrive in the 10th Division barracks. Toshiro, Hitsugaya and Matsumoto are facing off against Sternritter I, Kang-do. Toshiro creates this wall of ice which Kang bursts through, and then they clash, and Hitsugaya realises that he can't hurt Kang at all, it seems like. And this actually isn't Blute, but of course a little hint towards Kang's shrift, the iron. Kang then kicks Hitsugaya away, and I really like that they are already showing him to be a martial arts fighter. That's how he actually fights people, and the animation again used for Kang has so far been really nice. But Toshiro succeeds in freezing Kang's arm and says that he won't be able to use that arm anymore, and as Kang has killed so many of his comrades, he won't be holding back. But then we get this followed up by another really awesome moment where Kang-do kind of just taps the floor with his foot and charges against Hitsugaya, summoning the iron on his arm and kind of ramming his shoulder into Hitsugaya with such force that it sends the captain flying into a wall. The scene slows down momentarily to show you Hitsugaya's reaction to Kang slamming into him, to actually seeing the metallic sheen of Kang's skin as he's using the iron to bolster his physicality. And that is so good. Kang never used the iron in a battle scenario outside of the moment where he dies against Hashwolf, so to already see it here is a great improvement. We then get a fairly small extension to Soifon versus BG9. No hint to what the K shrift could be, though I didn't expect to get that just yet. But Soifon attempts to stab him with Suzumebachi, but she's horrified to realise it doesn't do anything, or at the very least she can't pierce him with it. I'm not entirely sure if this is supposed to be a reference to him using Blute, or if it's actually just supposed to be the fact that she hit a tendril rather than his actual body, because he bats her away with one of these whips, pulls it out, and attempts to stab her with one of these tentacle-like blades. It chases her around the air before slicing her across the cheek. Again, another nice bit of animation. And I like that she smirks at him as well, as though, you know, she realises this could be an opponent that's actually quite tricky. Byakuya then prepares to use his Bankai, of course, signalling a major moment of doom for the captains of the Gotei 13. Renji's line about Sasakibe's report is actually given to Byakuya here instead, as he talks about how Sasakibe told them that the enemy can actually seal Bankai, but at the same time, they're an enemy that cannot be defeated without Bankai. It was always interesting how the captains came to this realization so quickly after such a small amount of fighting. No one tries to use Kido or anything in the first invasion, which is kind of weird to me. So that's another reason why I appreciate those small extensions to the fights, because you do actually get to see that, yes, these guys might actually be stronger than the captain's Shikai, which is exactly what they're trying to show you in each of these different scenarios. Byakuya then says to Renji that they should want to go all out because these guys are the murderers of Sasakibe and they want to spill blood within the Seireitei. This line is actually taken from his arrival in chapter 496, but here in the anime, it was brought up to this scene instead. While we do get the other shots of the captains and the vice captains, their lines about how they should wait to see if their Bankai is sealed, at which point by working together with their vice captains, they can find a way to break that seal. Those lines are taken away from the other captains, and instead all of that explanation is given to Byakuya. At this point, they all activate their Bankai. This is obviously a huge rush of nostalgia, particularly Senbon Sakura Kageyoshi looks amazing. It's so cool seeing the blades rise, seeing Byakuya kind of move backwards towards them as they turn to petals. It looks fantastic. Jakuho Raikoben looks really cool, Daiguren Hyorinmaru looks really cool. The only one I thought was a little underwhelming was Komamura's. It seemed a lot smaller than usual, and it just sort of came out of nowhere as well, with no real fanfare. But of course the Bankai aren't going to be around for long anyway. The end of chapter 496 gives us the massive twist that the Quincy can't seal Bankai, but instead they use their medallions to literally rip it away from its Shinigami owner and use it for themselves. They can steal Bankai just like that. And this sequence is actually extended somewhat in the episode compared to the source material. We get a shot of all four of the Sternritter's faces again, like we do in the chapter itself. However, unlike the chapter where the Bankai are all kind of stolen in a single page, this scene is stretched out a little bit to show us each individual Bankai being properly taken apart and surrendered to one of the Sternritter. And it's here we get some, I think, really nice additional little details. It's so cool seeing that look of horror on Byakuya's face as the swords crumble and collapse behind him, as the petals of Senbon Sakura are sucked like a vortex into Az's medallion. That sort of thing is awesome. It's really cool seeing Jakuho Raikoben being literally disintegrated and absorbed by BG9's medal. All of those details I think work really, really well. I was surprised to see that the Sternritter were given the same capture animation and mechanic as Eburn. When Eburn uses the medallion, it summons that weird massive cross and the bars of blue light. In the manga, when the Sternritter try and steal the Bankai, it's really simplified in comparison. It's just a kind of burst of black, crackling reishi that kind of moves out like a ring of electricity, grabs the Bankai, and draws it back in. And I thought Kubo did this on purpose, to be honest, for a couple of reasons. A, it's way simpler to draw and decipher, but B, it showed as well that Eburn wasn't a proper Quincy and therefore had some really weird, elongated incantation he had to do to steal Bankai, but here the Sternritter are using the exact same method, whereas I thought theirs was simplified because they were actual Quincy and therefore could use this power without issue. But I guess the anime team just wanted to unify the look of having the Bankai stolen, perhaps? But this sequence ends with a lovely shot of Byakuya looking on as his Bankai is completely gone and the last petal floats away from him before being sucked into Asnod's medallion, at which point he lifts it to his face and gives us that wonderful trolly grin that we got at the end of chapter 496. And it's just really cool because obviously you can't see his mouth, but from the way his eyes go, you know he's giving Byakuya this huge smirk. And I've always loved that moment. It's like one of the standout moments for one of the Sternritter, gives him real personality. and they nailed it here as well. So at this point in the episode, we've reached the start of chapter 497, which opens with a bunch of Shinigami giving us their reactions to the Bankai being stolen. In the episode, characters like Matsumoto and Iba have their very brief lines cut, replaced instead with a new line for Bambietta, which I'm pretty happy with. We do also get a good look at BG9 holding his medallion, which, like I said in my trailer review, we didn't get anything like that. Kubo was being very coy with BG9 in particular in the first invasion. I will say though, much like the original source material, it is mostly Asnot and Bambietta whose personalities are being created here. Kang and BG9 are kind of still these faceless enemies, quite literally for Kang, who still has his hood up. Hitsugaya trying to communicate, trying desperately to talk with Hyorin Maru is the same as it is in the chapter, but I really like actually being able to see him crumple to his knees in despair. That works really well, but him turning to bark orders to Matsumoto, telling her use Tenteikura, tell the other captains about this fate, is again exactly the same as it appears in 497. I mentioned in my live reaction that I didn't recall Tenteikura ever being read before, but actually this is of course because Matsumoto, having no ink on her, because you know you need markings to initiate Tenteikura, uses her blood instead, which is a really cool detail, and I think making Tenteikura red as a result is really clever. Most of the follow-up reactions from the captains are identical, Shinji, Unohana, etc., but in the chapter, Yamamoto is seen leaping into action, presumably arriving on the battlefield, whereas here, he's still just standing in his office, looking out gloomily across the Soul Society. Admittedly, I think both actually work really well, and the more somber version of Yamamoto plays off nicely with soundscape to our door. Thankfully, the really nice bit of choreography between Kyoraku and Robert Akutrone is kept essentially totally intact here. And again is another very faithful scene to the source material. It's an awesome set piece. I love Kyoraku talking to Robert, kind of letting his guard down a little bit. Robert instantly appearing in front of him, trying to blast Kyoraku in the face. Kyoraku dodges, boots Robert in the gut, and then tries to finish him with a single swipe from his blade. Robert activates Grimaniel. We hear his voice briefly here as he appears right behind Kyoraku and blasts him in the eye. Again, it's basically panel for panel identical to the original chapter, and I love it. It looks so good, and I love Kyoraku saying, you know, I was trying to put on a brave face, but actually I am pretty shaken up, as he has now officially lost his eye, and he will look totally badass pretty much from here on out. It's actually at this point in the manga where the scene between Hashwoth and Squad 13 would have originally been. As Renji attempts to use Bankai in place of Byakuya, Byakuya shouts for him to stop, as they can't lose his as well. Byakuya's yell, I don't think was quite as impactful here as I was hoping it would be as how it appears in the original chapter, but it's still cool to see. As chapter 497 ends and the Soul Society crumbles, a desperate Akon demands that he be put through to Ichigo and says that he will take full responsibility for acting without Mayuri's permission. It's an awesome scene, really glad they kept it in here, really glad to see that they are keeping Akon as being this kind of free-thinking leader in many ways. He really comes out of his shell in the first invasion, and it made Akon something of a niche fan favourite. I mean, I think Akon's awesome, and basically all of that is down to how he was portrayed in the first Quincy invasion. It's nice to see some of that is preserved here. And so, as I think you can see, so far this episode has been one of the most faithful to date, with some really nice additional scenes in the form of those fights against the Sternritter, but something's gotta give. And chapters 498 and 499 to round off this episode are probably the parts of the episode that are the least faithful. But on the whole, I really don't think anything here is too egregious. The first couple of pages from chapter 498 are completely cut from this episode, where the Research and Development Division tries to work out how best to contact Ichigo. They ask how they can possibly get in touch with him, to which Akon says, you know, put through a line to his substitute Shinigami badge, which I really liked. That's a nice little connector to the Lost Agent arc, knowing that, of course, Soul Society can contact him whenever they need to through his badge. So that was really cool. Shame that was taken out. But when the Development Division discovers that Ichigo's badge is still in the human world, but Ichigo is not. Ichigo is in Hueco Mundo. They put 2 and 2 together, working out that his badge is actually in Kisuke Urahara's shop, and so they go to contact Urahara instead. All of that is missing from the episode, and instead Akon just immediately contacts Urahara. There's no context as to why he would go to Urahara first, but again, it's not a massive deal at the end of the day. And as I said last week, a good chunk of the Akon and Urahara conversation is cut here. Luckily, it's mostly just the comedic moments again, which I think mostly makes total sense. While I do think that some of those comedy moments do work in the original chapters, I think the tone is so dire at this point that we can happily do without them. While Kisuke does relay back to Akon that Ichigo is currently fighting Quilge OP and that Quilge is trying to steal his Bankai but so far is unable to do so, most of Akon's introspection regarding Ichigo is cut here. The entirety of their conversation is really trimmed down to basically the most bare essentials of the plot. However, the actual battle itself between Ichigo and Quilge has some really lovely animation. There's a great moment again. Quilge is another Sternritter using the more elaborate version of trying to capture someone's Bankai, but it's really cool because you see those bars of light try and go towards Ichigo only to break away from him, at which point a visibly frustrated Quilge is like, it's not working, I can't capture his Bankai, only for Ichigo to attack him once again. But the rest of their fight is really fluid and is really great to watch. They did cut some of Quilge's inner dialogue where he mentions knowing beforehand that Ichigo Kurosaki had a difficult to capture Bankai, but still he is struggling nonetheless. But it's really cool seeing him zipping around the desert, flying around, Ichigo attempting to attack him every now and then, Quilge swooping up into the air, but you can see as he looks around he has no idea where Ichigo is. Ichigo is too fast for him, and suddenly Ichigo appears above him, at which point Quilge is like, I've used my Volston dish, I've absorbed that monster, how is he overpowering me so? As Ichigo uses a Getsuga and just throws Quilge right back down to the desert sands. It all looks absolutely great. Much as he does exactly in the same way as the source material, Quilge summons a ring of arrows and fires them towards Ichigo. Ichigo deflects them with a couple of awesome slashes, but I have to be honest, I thought this shot in the original chapter was depicting Ichigo smashing away loads of arrows at once as a sort of callback to him using Bankai to deflect Senbon Zakura Kageyoshi, but maybe not. I do love how Ichigo just kind of appears upon Quilge on the ground almost immediately. He asks him again about sealing his Bankai. They did actually cut out another bit of introspection from Quilge here where he's talking about how he doesn't know how he's going to defeat Ichigo because he can't deal enough damage to him while in Blute Vein, the defensive Blute. But if he swaps to Blute Artery, he leaves himself too open to Ichigo, who is much faster than him and will invariably injure him. And without Blute Vein active, Quilge will take serious damage. I loved that in the original chapter because it was applying real tactics and strategy to the battle. It was really awesome seeing this villain playing it through his head and being like, I don't know how I'm going to win this, I can't beat him. And there's a nice moment where, just before Ichigo speaks to him, Quilge says, do I call for backup? And he's like, I can't, if I do that. And it trails off, but obviously he's like, if I do that, I'll be killed. His Majesty won't stand for it if I call for backup. They got rid of all of that, which I thought was a little bit of a shame, but they do have a really nice exchange nonetheless, where Ichigo says, why do you guys keep trying to seal Bankai? Could it be that you're afraid of Bankai? And Quilge explodes at him. He's like, the Vandenreich fear nothing. And I just think that Quilge has been, I've said this every week for the last 3 weeks, but I think Quilge has been done pretty much perfectly. Pretty much perfectly. The voice actor is killing it. The animation is great. He comes across as extremely arrogant, standoffish, pompous, flamboyant, and I think it's just great, and I'm really going to miss this character come next week. Another interesting thing to point out is that the anime has yet to acknowledge, really, the two substantial different versions of Blute Artery and Blute Vein. They've never called them that by name. Kisuke does mention a little bit later on that there are two separate modes, offensive and defensive, and they can't use them both at the same time. But I do wonder if they're scaling back the idea of Blute a little bit, because realistically, it never comes up again after the first invasion. Of course, at this point, Quilge is blasted through the chest by Urahara. I never really thought about how crazy it is that Urahara's Kido just punches a hole through Quilge like that, but he manages to do it, and at this point, Kisuke instructs Ichigo, return to the Soul Society. He tosses him his phone. All of this basically identical to the manga, and this rounds out chapter 498. This section of the episode is now the start of 499, and again, it's pretty much identical. Hiyosu of the R&D department informs the rest of the division to let the Raiteitai know of the special forces that Ichigo is on the way from Hueco Mundo, and to let the rest of the captains and vice captains know this vital information. The structure here is changed up ever so slightly. Immediately after this moment in the anime, we see the character of Rin kind of crying with relief at the fact that Ichigo is about to arrive, but that doesn't happen until around about the title drop in chapter 499 in the source material. Actually, in this moment, we get the section where Orihime and Chad approach Urahara, and he tells them to find the medallion on Quilge's body. Just those two moments are basically swapped around. I would assume for convenience's sake, for the fact that we've just seen the R&D department, so we may as well follow that up with the shot of Rin. And that character within the R&D division really does look like Aizen. I don't know why they keep doing this. Like Kajimaru, fair enough, because that was the design Kubo came up with, but this guy looks so much like Aizen as well. It's just turning into a bit of a joke at this point. Sadly, the vast majority of the conversation between Ichigo and Akon is cut. In the anime, their conversation begins with Akon telling him that the Quincy can steal Bankai, and Ichigo's kind of aghast reaction to that, but this is actually pretty much the end of their conversation in the original chapter. Prior to this moment in the manga, there is a full conversation between Akon and Ichigo where Akon kind of breaks down everything that is going on so far. He tells Ichigo about all the dead Shinigami, the destroyed buildings, and even tells him about a potentially dead vice captain, making sure to let Ichigo know that it's not Renji or Rukia, which is a really nice moment that, again, I wish they'd kept in. Ichigo kind of protests. He says, that's not what I meant when I asked if one of them had died, and Akon says, I know, but I'm just telling you what I think you need to know. It's a great character moment because Akon is like, he needs Ichigo not to fall to despair, but at the same time he's telling him everything that's happening. So his immediate thought is that Ichigo will think a vice captain's dead, it could be Rukia or Renji, so Akon quickly allays his fears. I thought that was a really nice character moment and quite a humanizing character moment as well for both Akon and Ichigo. Akon then goes on to tell Ichigo everything he knows about the Sternritter, what they're wearing, what they call themselves, how many of them there seem to be. All of that is cut from this moment in the anime. Perhaps most crucially, Akon also tells Ichigo that the enemy has not yet suffered a single loss. There has been no report of victory from the side of the Shinigami. I do wish they'd included a bit more of this conversation because it really does highlight just how bad the situation is. Yes, we can see firsthand with our own eyes that things are not looking good in the Seirei, but it's really cool to get that sit rep from somebody who has access to surveillance and can see the scope of the entire battle. And when Akon says we know nothing about their abilities because that's how bad it is out in the field, you know the Soul Society is in major trouble from all fronts. However, Akon does tell Ichigo which captains have had their Bankai stolen, at which point Urahara buzzes in and joins in on the conversation with his little kind of augmented reality keyboard. Again, I really like that, the first stage of his base camp that he would set up in Hueco Mundo. It's here that Urahara kind of just runs down the Quincy's abilities very briefly, tells Ichigo about Volstendish, tells him about Blute. Blute, again, is given way more prominence in the manga in this moment. Kisuke says that, I don't think they can use attack and defense at the same time, so we may have to devise a strategy where exploiting this weakness becomes a key way of defeating the Sternritter. But considering how this never really comes up again, I can see why it was removed. I do think it is a little bit weird how Ichigo just seems to be sailing through the Garganta like he no longer needs to even run. Like, he's definitely running in the manga, and it makes it look a little bit more urgent, I think, than him just sort of standing there and being guided along this pathway. But, you know, it is what it is. For what it's worth, the Garganta itself I think looks pretty cool, and the lighting on Ichigo is really nice as well. Interestingly, in the chapter version of this conversation, Kisuke mentions that he doesn't know why they can't steal Ichigo's Bankai outside of just wild speculation, which he himself admits. But he does go on to say that he thinks the enemy coordinated their invasion in such a way as to invade Soul Society while Ichigo wasn't there because they see him as a great threat. Kisuke then says it's going to be a very dangerous battle and he'll head there as soon as he can. And again, I think this was really good stuff and probably shouldn't have been gotten rid of. In the anime, this conversation is actually about to end, unless the subtitles are wrong perhaps, with Kisuke explaining why they can't take Ichigo's Bankai, which I think was interesting because reasonably he shouldn't know that. He shouldn't know why yet. He's barely seen these guys in action. So for me, that did feel like a little bit weird, and maybe they mess with that a little bit too much. Just like in the source material, however, an arrow suddenly blasts past Ichigo and latches on to the Garganta's exit. It looks really cool here. I love the way it kind of ripples outwards into a Quincy cross and then begins to seal the jaws of the Garganta shut. Really cool seeing the jail actually forcibly pulling the doorway closed. That's a really cool moment, and it looks great in motion. We see that Quilge has blasted Kisuke, Orihime, and Chad. All of them are quite seriously injured. It's exactly the same in the manga, but it's actually more visible here in the anime. Kisuke realizes that Quilge is using Ranso Tengai to keep his shattered body standing upright, at which point he fires another arrow directly at Ichigo, saying that His Majesty ordered him to keep Ichigo from the Soul Society even at the cost of his own life. The arrow collides with Ichigo, encases him within this reishi jail, and Quilge seemingly has won. As the Garganta closes around Ichigo, trapping him within, Quilge gloats with a maniacal laugh that Ichigo was so close to saving the Soul Society, but now he can only sit and watch from his prison as Soul Society falls. It's a great ending, and like I said in my predictions last week, made total sense to be the cliffhanger of this episode. When it comes to the poems after the credits, I actually saw that they are supposedly preview poems, so the poems are actually referencing the episode to come, which makes a lot more sense, as last week I was like, why have we got a Hitsugaya poem? That makes no sense at all, but of course it is referencing this week, and as I said, the poem regarding a shadow of a wing was quite clearly a reference to them losing their Bankai. So this week's poem is actually about Sasakibe, which of course again makes a ton of sense, as we should get at least some of his flashback with Yamamoto next time. His poem, The Vow, rests in the shadow of the willow, even as the lightning fades, seems to be mostly referencing their flashback, the vow that Sasakibe made for Yamamoto, which lingers on even in death, even as Sasakibe's lightning disappears. Again, perhaps a reference to the fact that we will see his Bankai next week as well. And so with that, that's the end of episode 4. We see that the title of episode 5 is none other than Wrath as a Lightning, and again it should be another good one. So to wrap up this video, as we always do, with some predictions for the next episode. Now I think there is a good chance that next week they will go back to adapting a massive 6 chapters. My main reasoning for this is because I think 505 is a much better and more natural cliffhanger than 504. And so presumably next week I think they will cover chapters 500 through to 505. The ending of 504 is when Yamamoto incinerates Driscoll, which, while a cool moment, I don't think personally lends itself to a full episode cliffhanger, whereas the ending of 505 is much better suited when Yamamoto, enraged, arrives to rescue Kenpachi and confronts none other than Yhwach himself. That, to me, seems like the perfect way to leave an episode, and I think that's why they will cover tons next week. And yeah, that makes me a little bit nervous, because if they are going to cover 6 chapters, that means there is a ton we are going to see stuffed into episode 5. I mean a ton. That means we will get the entirety of Byakuya and Renji versus Asnot. We will get all of Kenpachi Zaraki's arrival with the 3 Sternritter, and if they decide to extend any of that at all, we will get all of Sasakibe and Yamamoto's flashback, as well as Yamamoto versus Driscoll, and then we'll get all of 505 on top of that as well when the Shinigami start to get their morale back. That seems like an awful lot to me. I could see there being some more serious structural changes, especially if they keep doing this thing where the episode's title card is drawn in the same way as it is in the manga. Now, this one will be a little more difficult, and so I wonder if maybe they will make up one like I think they did for Foundation Stones, because Wrath as a Lightning just kind of appears on the side of the page next to Kenpachi of all characters, nothing even really to do with lightning. So I wonder if they'll change that around a bit as well, because that chapter, Wrath as a Lightning, is 503, I think, which means it will be probably over the halfway point of the episode should they stick to a standard structure. So I think they will move things around a little bit. Ironically though, despite the episode being called Wrath as a Lightning, that won't be the main talking point. I think if they do it right, the main talking point will undoubtedly be Byakuya and his fate at the hands of Az. They have to get that right. It has to be perfect. Like, you know, I'm putting a lot of pressure on it here, but it's one of the biggest moments of the first invasion, one of the biggest moments of the 1,000-year Blood War arc. It has to feel desperate. It has to feel gruesome, gory, helpless. It has to be, like, truly dark and depressing. It's going to be a crazy, crazy scene, and I really hope they get it right. I'm hoping they don't really cut anything from that battle. I could maybe see them trimming Az's monologue about fear a little bit. It will be cool, of course, to hear him speak as well. That'd be really awesome. But yeah, I'm really looking forward to that sequence. I do wonder how much, if anything, we will see of Kenpachi versus the 3 Sternritter he killed. If they're trying to do 6 chapters, they're already working on very limited time. So whether we actually get any extension to that or not, I don't really know. Obviously, that moment where Zaraki arrives with those Sternritter is supposed to be a kind of shock moment. It's supposed to be a triumphant moment. But the surprise wouldn't really be there if we saw that fight beforehand. Maybe, if anything, we will see some extension of the battle when Kenpachi is explaining it, but other than that, I'm not really sure. We should also hopefully see who Rukia's mysterious opponent is next week as well, as it's in chapter 502 when she turns tail and runs, only to be cut down. And so yeah, when looking at what the episode can cover, it becomes increasingly difficult to know what to cut. I think when looking at cuts, you've got to look earlier in the episode. I think a lot of chapter 500 could be potentially cut. The stuff about, again, the research and development division, if they weren't afraid to cut it in this episode, they probably won't be afraid to cut it in this next one either. I think we'll obviously see them get attacked by the zombified Jidanbo, but I think they could cut most of everything earlier on when the division tries to tell everyone about Ichigo arriving, when Akon realizes that something has gone wrong. They might cut most, if not all of that. It's also possible that they cut a sequence from the Sasakibe flashback, but considering the episode is named basically after that flashback, that would be a little bit weird. And also, finally, this is going to be our last chance to see anything from Chojuro versus Driscoll. Now, I appreciate that probably wasn't really much of a fight at all. It does seem like Chojuro probably just activated Bankai immediately, only to have it stolen and then have himself be killed. But if they're going to show us anything from that fight, now is the time to do it. And if we don't see anything, I think it'll be a bit of an indicator as to how much we get to see from future off-screen fights. But that's it for our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of episode 4, Kill the Shadow. Let me know in the comments below, guys, what did you think of this week's episode? Did you enjoy it? Did I miss anything from this analysis that was either cut or added to the episode? Please do let me know. I'd love to hear it. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already, guys, and until next time, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.